The photographs arrived on President John F. Kennedy's desk on the morning of October 16, 1962, and with them came the knowledge that human civilization might end within days. The black and white reconnaissance images, taken by a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba at 72,000 feet, showed something that transformed the Cold War from tense standoff into immediate existential crisis. Soviet nuclear missiles, capable of reaching Washington, D.C. in 13 minutes, were being installed just 90 miles from American shores. Kennedy stared at the grainy photographs showing missile transporters, launch pads under construction, and the unmistakable infrastructure of nuclear war positioned in America's backyard. In that moment, the 35-year-old president understood that every decision he made over the next days could be humanity's last. One wrong choice, one moment of miscalculation, one failure of nerve or excessive aggression could trigger a nuclear exchange that would kill hundreds of millions of people and possibly render the planet uninhabitable. The question that would haunt Kennedy and his advisors for 13 desperate days was not merely how to remove the missiles, but how to do so without igniting World War III. What followed was the most dangerous moment in human history, when the fate of civilization rested on the judgment of a young president, and when humanity came closer to self-annihilation than most people will ever know. To understand how the world reached the edge of nuclear apocalypse in October 1962, we must first comprehend the terrifying logic of Cold War nuclear strategy. By 1962, both the United States and Soviet Union possessed thousands of nuclear weapons with the combined destructive power to destroy all life on Earth multiple times over. The United States had approximately 25,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union had around 3,300. These were not the relatively small atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. These were thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs measured in megatons, each one capable of destroying an entire city and rendering the surrounding area uninhabitable for generations. A single Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missile of the type being installed in Cuba carried a warhead with a yield of 1 megaton, roughly 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The strategic doctrine governing these arsenals was called mutual assured destruction, appropriately abbreviated as MAD. The theory was simple and horrifying. Neither side would launch a nuclear first strike, because doing so would guarantee their own destruction through retaliation. If the Soviet Union attacked the United States with nuclear weapons, American missiles would automatically launch in response, destroying the Soviet Union. If the United States attacked first, Soviet missiles would retaliate, destroying America. This mutual suicide pact was supposed to keep the peace through fear. No rational leader would choose certain death. But the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the fatal flaw in this logic. It assumed perfect rationality, perfect communication, and perfect control over events. In October 1962, none of these assumptions held true. The crisis had its roots in the Bay of Pigs disaster 17 months earlier. In April 1961, Kennedy had authorized a CIA-planned invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro Cuban exiles, hoping to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government. The invasion was a catastrophic failure. The exile force was destroyed, Kennedy was humiliated, and Castro grew closer to the Soviet Union. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev concluded that Kennedy was young, weak, and could be intimidated. This perception was reinforced when Kennedy met Khrushchev in Vienna in June 1961, and the older Soviet leader essentially bullied the American president, threatening to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would cut off Western access to Berlin. Kennedy left Vienna shaken, telling a journalist, "He just beat the hell out of me." Khrushchev decided to test Kennedy's resolve by placing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Soviet leader had multiple motivations: protecting Cuba from another American invasion, countering American missiles positioned in Turkey on the Soviet border, and demonstrating Soviet strength to both the Americans and to hardliners within his own government. In the summer of 1962, Soviet ships began transporting missiles, launch equipment, and thousands of Soviet military personnel to Cuba under the guise of defensive military aid. The operation was conducted in absolute secrecy. Even most Soviet officials didn't know about it. Castro enthusiastically welcomed the missiles, seeing them as protection against American aggression. The Americans suspected something was happening, but initially couldn't prove it. Cuban refugees reported seeing Soviet missiles, but their accounts were dismissed as unreliable. Throughout September 1962, Kennedy publicly warned that any offensive Soviet weapons in Cuba would be unacceptable, while privately his intelligence agencies struggled to confirm what was actually happening. The Soviets lied repeatedly, with Khrushchev personally assuring Kennedy that the USSR would never place offensive weapons in Cuba, only defensive anti-aircraft missiles. Then came October 14, 1962. Two reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Major Richard Hazer flew over western Cuba and photographed what CIA analysts immediately recognized as medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction. The photographs were rushed to Washington, analyzed overnight, and delivered to Kennedy's National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, early on October 16. Bundy decided to let Kennedy sleep undisturbed one final night before telling him that the world had fundamentally changed. When Bundy briefed the president over breakfast on October 16, Kennedy's first reaction was anger. Anger at Khrushchev for lying to him, anger at his own intelligence services for not detecting the missiles earlier, and anger at being forced into an impossible situation. Kennedy immediately convened a secret group of his most trusted advisors, which came to be called the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM. The members included his brother Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, CIA Director John McCone, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, and several other senior officials. Kennedy tasked this group with developing options for responding to the missiles while maintaining absolute secrecy. The president understood that if news leaked before he was ready to act, he would lose control of the situation. Khrushchev might accelerate the missile deployment, or public panic might force Kennedy's hand. For the next week, EXCOM met constantly in the cabinet room and in the State Department, debating American options. The discussions were extraordinarily tense, with strong-willed men arguing passionately for different courses of action. The deliberations were secretly recorded by Kennedy, providing historians with an unprecedented window into how decisions are made during a supreme crisis. The tapes reveal brilliant analysis, terrible mistakes, enormous pressure, and the frightening reality that even the most powerful and intelligent people in the world were struggling to find a solution that wouldn't lead to nuclear war. The military chiefs presented Kennedy with what they considered the only viable option: immediate massive airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by an invasion of Cuba. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff and a legendary World War II commander, argued forcefully that only overwhelming military action would solve the problem. LeMay believed the Soviets were weak and wouldn't retaliate if America acted decisively. He told Kennedy directly that failing to attack would be almost as bad as the appeasement at Munich before World War II. The other Joint Chiefs agreed with LeMay, unanimously recommending air strikes and invasion. But Kennedy and several of his civilian advisors recognized the catastrophic risks of the military option. Air strikes might not destroy all the missiles. The Air Force could only guarantee destroying about 90% of known sites, and there might be unknown sites as well. Even a few surviving missiles could kill millions of Americans. Moreover, thousands of Soviet personnel were in Cuba operating the missiles. An American airstrike would certainly kill Soviet soldiers, which might force Khrushchev to retaliate to avoid looking weak. That retaliation might come in Cuba, but it might also come in Berlin, where Soviet forces vastly outnumbered American troops. A clash in Berlin could escalate to war in Europe, which would almost certainly go nuclear. The dominoes of escalation, once pushed, might be impossible to stop. An alternative emerged from the discussions: a naval blockade, called a quarantine, to avoid the legal implications of the term blockade, which is an act of war, preventing Soviet ships from delivering additional missiles to Cuba. The quarantine would buy time for negotiations while demonstrating American resolve. It was less aggressive than airstrikes, but more forceful than mere diplomacy. Kennedy found this middle option appealing, but it had serious problems. A blockade wouldn't remove the missiles already in Cuba. It would take days to implement, giving the Soviets time to complete the installations, and it risked confrontation at sea if Soviet ships refused to stop. As XCOM debated through October 17, 18, and 19, Kennedy maintained his regular public schedule to avoid arousing suspicion. He gave speeches, attended meetings, and even flew to Chicago for a campaign event. Though he cut the trip short, claiming a cold, and returned to Washington to continue crisis deliberations. The president was exhausted, his chronic back pain was flaring, and he was taking various medications that may have affected his judgment. Yet he had to remain outwardly calm while inwardly wrestling with the possibility that his decisions might doom humanity. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy addressed the American people and the world in a televised speech that revealed the existence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announced the American response. 40 million Americans watched as their young president explained that unmistakable evidence proved that the Soviet Union had placed offensive nuclear missiles in Cuba, that this constituted an unacceptable threat, and that the United States was implementing a strict quarantine of Cuba to prevent further military equipment from reaching the island. Kennedy demanded that the Soviet Union remove the missiles and warned that any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union against the United States, requiring full retaliatory response. In other words, if Cuba launched missiles, America would strike the Soviet Union, triggering nuclear war. The speech was deliberately calibrated to sound firm but not bellicose, resolute but not reckless. Kennedy wanted to demonstrate American strength without backing Khrushchev into a corner with no option but to fight. Yet the speech was fundamentally an ultimatum: remove the missiles or face American action. The world immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Stock markets plunged. Governments around the globe scrambled to understand what was happening. Ordinary citizens stocked up on food and water, built fallout shelters, and prayed. For the first time, nuclear war seemed not just possible but probable. The quarantine line went into effect on October 24th. The U.S. Navy positioned dozens of warships in an arc around Cuba, prepared to intercept any Soviet vessels approaching the island. In Washington, the question everyone asked was, would Soviet ships stop, or would they try to run the blockade? If Soviet vessels refused to stop, would American ships fire on them? If American ships fired on Soviet vessels, would that trigger war? The tension was unbearable. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously said, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked when reports came that Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line had stopped or turned back. But this was only a temporary reprieve. The missiles remained in Cuba, and the clock was ticking. What Kennedy and his advisors didn't know, and wouldn't learn until decades later, was how close they actually came to nuclear war during those 13 days. Unbeknownst to American intelligence, the Soviets had not only installed medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, but had also deployed tactical nuclear weapons, short-range nuclear missiles designed for battlefield use. More terrifyingly, Soviet commanders in Cuba had been given pre-authorization to use these tactical nuclear weapons if the United States invaded and Soviet communications with Moscow were cut. This meant that a single Soviet commander, unable to contact his government, could start a nuclear war on his own authority. If Kennedy had followed the military's advice and ordered an invasion, American troops would almost certainly have been hit with nuclear weapons, which would have triggered American nuclear retaliation against Cuba and probably the Soviet Union, which would have led to Soviet nuclear strikes against the United States and its allies. Civilization could have ended because of procedures and pre-delegated authorities that the American leadership didn't even know existed. The crisis intensified dramatically on October 27th, subsequently known as Black Saturday. Multiple incidents occurred that brought the world to the very brink of nuclear war. First, a U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing Anderson. The shoot-down violated Khrushchev's orders. He had not authorized firing on American aircraft, but Soviet forces in Cuba were under enormous stress and fired anyway. Kennedy's military chiefs immediately demanded retaliation. The rules of engagement specified that if reconnaissance aircraft were fired upon, America would destroy the anti-aircraft site responsible. Under those rules, Kennedy should have ordered airstrikes immediately. But Kennedy overruled his own rules of engagement, deciding that escalation at this moment was too dangerous. On that same day, an American U-2 spy plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly triggering a Soviet response. The pilot had become lost during a routine mission from Alaska and had wandered hundreds of miles into USSR territory. Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept and destroy the American plane. American F-102 fighters, armed with nuclear-tipped air-to-air missiles, yes, nuclear weapons, scrambled from Alaska to protect the U-2. For a few minutes, American and Soviet fighters armed with nuclear weapons were heading toward each other over the Arctic. If they had engaged, and if a nuclear weapon had been used, the escalation ladder to full nuclear war would have been very short. Fortunately, the U-2 pilot realized his mistake, corrected course, and got out of Soviet airspace before intercept occurred. Also on October 27th, near Cuba, the Americans had been tracking Soviet submarines and were trying to force them to surface using practice depth charges, small explosive charges that wouldn't damage the submarines but would signal them to surface. What the Americans didn't know was that these submarines carried nuclear torpedoes, and the submarine commanders had authorization to use them under certain circumstances. One submarine, B-59, was out of radio contact with Moscow, had been under continuous American harassment for days, its batteries were nearly dead, its crew was suffocating in 120-degree heat, and its captain believed that war had already begun. The captain, Valentin Savitsky, ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch against the American ships. The political officer agreed. According to Soviet protocol, only these two officers needed to agree to launch the nuclear weapon. However, by chance, the flotilla commander, Vasily Arkhipov, was also aboard B-59, and his approval was required because of his senior rank. Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch. A heated argument ensued, with the captain insisting war had started and they must respond, while Arkhipov insisted they must surface and await orders. Arkhipov's opposition prevailed. The submarine surfaced and did not fire its nuclear torpedo. Had Arkhipov not been aboard that particular submarine, or had he made a different decision, a nuclear weapon would have been used against American ships, almost certainly triggering full nuclear war. The world came within one man's decision of Armageddon, and the American leadership didn't even know it was happening. Back in Washington, Kennedy faced enormous pressure to escalate. His military chiefs considered him weak for not retaliating after the U-2 shootdown. Several ex-com members argued that time was running out and that military action was now necessary. But Kennedy continued searching for a diplomatic solution. That evening, Robert Kennedy met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin and delivered a message: the missiles must be removed, or America would remove them by force. But Robert Kennedy also added an unofficial promise. If the Soviets withdrew the missiles from Cuba, the United States would quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey several months later. This wasn't an explicit trade. Kennedy couldn't publicly trade the missiles without looking weak, but it was an understanding that addressed one of Khrushchev's key concerns. On October 28th, Khrushchev sent a message to Kennedy announcing that the Soviet Union would dismantle the missiles in Cuba and return them to the USSR. Khrushchev had decided that the risk of nuclear war was too great. He blamed the crisis on aggressive imperialist circles in the United States, deflecting blame from himself, but accepted Kennedy's public assurances that the U.S. would not invade Cuba. The crisis was over. Humanity had survived. The aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis transformed both leaders and international relations. Kennedy, sobered by how close the world had come to annihilation, began pursuing arms control and détente with the Soviet Union. In June 1963, he delivered a speech at American University calling for a re-examination of U.S. attitudes toward the Soviet Union, acknowledging Soviet suffering in World War II, and proposing practical steps to reduce nuclear dangers. 2 months later, the United States and Soviet Union signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in space, and underwater. A direct communications link, the hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow to prevent future misunderstandings. Both sides stepped back from the nuclear brink. Khrushchev faced different consequences. Soviet hardliners viewed the missile withdrawal as a humiliating retreat. In October 1964, Khrushchev was forced from power in a coup by Communist Party colleagues who considered him reckless and weak. His successors, particularly Leonid Brezhnev, pursued a massive military buildup to ensure the Soviet Union would never again be forced to back down. The crisis that nearly ended civilization thus set in motion an intensified arms race that would continue for another quarter century. Kennedy himself would not live to see the long-term consequences of the crisis. 13 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. His presidency had lasted less than 3 years, but those years, particularly those 13 days in October 1962, had tested him as few presidents have ever been tested. The decisions Kennedy made during the crisis likely saved hundreds of millions of lives. Had he followed his military chief's advice and launched air strikes and invasion, nuclear war was not just possible but probable. Had he been more aggressive in enforcing the quarantine, incidents at sea might have spiraled into conflict. Had he been more rigid in negotiations, refusing to offer Khrushchev any face-saving way out, the Soviet leader might have felt forced to fight. Kennedy's judgment, his ability to resist pressure from his generals, his willingness to find diplomatic solutions while maintaining military pressure, his capacity to see the crisis from Khrushchev's perspective, prevented catastrophe. Yet Kennedy's handling of the crisis was not without serious errors. Multiple times during October 1962, nuclear war was prevented only by the restraint of individual officers who had authority to launch nuclear weapons but chose not to do so. The system of nuclear deterrence had not worked as planned. It had nearly failed catastrophically, and only human judgment, sometimes the judgment of submarine commanders and air defense officers, not presidents and premiers, had saved civilization. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the closest humanity has come to nuclear war, though there have been other dangerous moments. False alarms that nearly triggered responses, accidents that could have escalated, periods of high tension when war seemed possible. But October 1962 stands alone because both sides knowingly and deliberately approached the nuclear threshold, fully aware of what hung in the balance, and still nearly stumbled into the abyss. It was not a case of miscommunication or technical failure. It was two superpowers, armed with world-destroying arsenals, testing each other's resolve in a confrontation where both sides understood that one wrong move meant annihilation. The lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is not that strong leadership and good judgment will always prevent nuclear war. The lesson is how fragile nuclear peace is, how easily miscalculation can lead to catastrophe, and how human beings are not naturally equipped to manage weapons that can destroy civilization in minutes. Kennedy made good decisions during the crisis, but he also made decisions that helped create the crisis. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles, but only after bringing the world to the edge of the abyss. Soviet submarine commander Vasily Arkhipov refused to launch a nuclear torpedo, but his captain had been ready to fire. At every stage, the margin between survival and extinction was razor thin, dependent on individuals making correct choices under extreme pressure with imperfect information. The world survived October 1962, but the weapons that nearly destroyed civilization then are still with us now. Many thousands of nuclear warheads distributed among 9 countries, maintained in ready-to-launch status, targeted at cities and military installations around the world. The technology has improved. Missiles are faster, warheads are more powerful, guidance systems are more accurate. But human beings remain the same, subject to the same pressures, the same miscalculations, the same limits of judgment that nearly doomed us during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We survived one decision away from nuclear war in October 1962. The terrifying question is whether we will survive the next crisis, whenever it comes, and whether the nuclear luck that saved humanity once will hold again. The photographs that arrived on Kennedy's desk on October 16, 1962, changed the world. They revealed that human civilization could end at any moment, through accident or design, through miscalculation or malice. That revelation remains true today. We are still, every day, one decision away from nuclear war.